Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Logita Wash Processed Ethiopia from Apollon's Gold. And there's the bag right there. And Apollon's Gold, based out of Tokyo, Japan. And this is part 2 of our 4-part Apollon's Gold series that will feature a bonus Friday video, as well as a very special coffee on Saturday, so stay tuned for both of those. This is now their 4th ever appearance on this channel. And up to this point, we've seen a recurring theme with the coffees that we have reviewed from them, and it's that they've all come out pretty light, tame, and delicate in general. So it's going to be interesting to see if this Ethiopia follows along that trend, as this right here is day 62. And once again, Apollon's Gold does have a brew guide on the back of their bags, and it's a very loose brew guide. They have between 93 and 97 degrees Celsius, and they have between 15.625 and 16.67 to 1 as their water to coffee ratio. So that's right in line with our standard recipe, and that's what we went with for this coffee as well. A 16 to 1 water to coffee ratio brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I also like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile, as we also mentioned in our previous Apollon's Gold review, they roast on a very light spectrum, as this coffee is very, very light by most standards and metrics. Yet again, one of the lightest coffees that we have reviewed on this channel. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 45, first impression, and that's the first note I have on here, as it's a pretty light coffee, as there is a slight fruit aspect to the cup, but it is much more in line with the listed black tea that they had noted on there, with a lighter body and a slight bit of savoriness to the cup. A little bit more sweetness to it as it does cool down, but for the most part, it's very delicate. It goes along the term light in so many ways, between the body, the profile, as well as the just entire experience within the cup, just light overall. So that was my first impression. We continue on to day 48 as we ran it through the Chemex, and the cup felt a little bit more defined, as the savoriness of the black tea was a little bit more pronounced with an even lighter body, if you can imagine so much, and then a peach forward base. So it was nicer in that aspect, that there was a little bit more peachiness to the cup, although it did seem to accentuate a lot of the black tea-like characteristics. So I was getting a little bit more from the cup on this day. In addition to that, a little bit of this floral citric component in the background, just overall very Ethiopian-like in general. Day 50, ran it through the April dripper, and it's slightly more vibrant at the forefront, but a little bit more tame otherwise. So I was getting a little bit right from the start, and it was that black tea aspect that's very much right at the start of the cup. Outside of that, there's a slight bit of that kind of delicate, savory tea-like aspect with a little bit more brightness as the cup cools. Slightly herbal as well, but a little less of those fruit aspects, a little bit less of the peach, a little bit less of the citrus. So not necessarily enjoying it as much through the April, but we continue on through day 52. We ran it back through the V60, and it's the best it's been up to this point. So this is why I settled on the V60, was mostly because of this day. It was reminiscent of very light Ethiopian coffees, as there is a peachiness, and it is in a more subtle sense with an abundance of this black tea-like body and savory profile right at the forefront. There continues to be plenty of brightness. It's a pretty decent cup in general, but I definitely do prefer my Ethiopian coffees, especially when they do have peach-like characteristics, to have a lot more of that as opposed to the kind of savory black tea aspects. So for that reason, it was nice, best day of the coffee we had experienced, but even then it wasn't necessarily my preference when it comes to washed Ethiopian coffees. Day 56, back through the Chemex, and definitely settled on the V60 after this day, as the Chemex seems to accentuate a lot of the overly light and tame characteristics to the cup, as there isn't anything on this day that's overly pronounced with this brew method. Skewing a lot more on the savory side of things, yet again with a very light body, to the point where it was just a little too light for me. Somebody that doesn't necessarily mind or care too much about body texture in coffee, I was even a little off-put by how light the body was coming from this coffee. Slight citrus and peachy aspects in the background yet again, so just an okay day on this one. So we continue on to day 59. Final notes we have back through the V60, and the coffee continues to remain very light, delicate, and tame, with a heavy emphasis on the black tea-like characteristics. Once again, there are peachy and citric components in the background, but for the most part, it continues to remain a little bit more of that savory tea-like cup. So it's been consistent in that sense. I think the two distinguishing factors between the brew methods were the Chemex really seemed to accentuate more of those savory characteristics, while also kind of diminishing what little body there was in the cup to begin with. So that made it a very easy sell on me with the V60 over the Chemex. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. All right, and we have 4 level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. And we'll start with the cleanliness. Level 4, yet again, this coffee is just very clean in general. I think all of the coffees that we're going to be reviewing from them are minimum level 4. If anything, that Costa Rican was maybe the least clean of these 4 coffees that we're reviewing, and that's not necessarily saying a whole lot because this one right here was just, I mean, it's a washed Ethiopian coffee. You fully expect it to be a pretty clean coffee in general. Finish, level 4. Yes, that was very much attributed to the savory black tea aspects within this coffee, so not too much to say on that. I think, once again, this tasting wheel is kind of relative to the rest of the coffee. This coffee was tame in general to begin with, so having some of these things score on the higher side of these marks doesn't necessarily mean that they were overly strong or pronounced characteristics in general, but for what you're expecting relative to the rest of this coffee, that's where they score. Acidity, level 4. Yet again, that's been the theme with the coffees that we've reviewed from them, is that they do have a fair bit of brightness. This one's no exception. Definitely experienced that right at the forefront of the coffee all the way throughout the duration of drinking it. Savoriness, level 4, and that's the only, I guess we'll say, flavor profile that we're discussing within this coffee that reaches that level 4 mark. And that was the first thing I noticed from it, and it was the most consistent and dominant aspect within this coffee. I was a little surprised how black tea forward it was, because most of the time when I do have these washed Ethiopian coffees, it might have that characteristic in one sense. It might be a little bit more in terms of the body, or it might be a little bit more in terms of the flavor profile. But for this one to lean that heavily into that direction as opposed to some of the other fruit aspects of the coffee was an interesting change of pace for me. I don't think I've ever scored a level 4 for a savoriness for an Ethiopian coffee and not scored any of the fruit factors equally as high. So let's discuss those fruit factors, as we do have all 3 of them at that level 3 mark. The berry fruit, level 3. Yeah, I could see it. It's not necessarily quite as pronounced or defined as the citric aspects or the stone fruit aspects within this coffee, but there is a slight kind of tropical berry that's present within this coffee. And then the citrus fruit and the stone fruit, yes, the citrus I think kind of goes in line with just how much brightness there is within this coffee. So I could see that. The stone fruit, I wish I could get more of the peachiness from it, but truth be told, I think that those were about as high I could put any of those 3 marks, because while there is fruit-like aspects, I think that they were buried underneath what was a very strong savory black tea-like aspect at the forefront of this coffee. So those at a level 3, I agree with. Florality, level 3, that's another thing that I might have expected to score a little bit more high within this coffee, but even then, I think it was just kind of dominated by the very strong black tea aspect. Body, level 2, yes. So I've been mentioning that once I went through the Chemex, it went all the way down to a level 1, and there was very little body or texture to the cup. So that was one reason why the V60 really seemed to perform better with this coffee. So body level 2, even then, it's still on the lower side of the level 2. Pretty light-bodied cup of coffee in general. And then final thing, the sweetness, level 3. Once again, it's been an issue with the coffees that I've had from them, is I'm trying to get more sweetness out of them. And even after following their instructions and letting it rest the allotted 46 plus days, I still struggle to get a lot of vibrancy and sweetness from the coffee in general. So this one didn't have it either, as much as I might have been expecting. So it's been, once again, consistent with all of the other coffees we reviewed from Apollon's Gold up to this point. So don't have too much to say on this tasting wheel. I think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Again, we're kind of falling along those same lines where I find their coffees to be even more delicate and tame than something I prefer, which is, once again, kind of saying something given that these are my type of coffees to begin with. But I just struggle to get a lot of the sweetness from these coffees, and I do think that it's because they're just roasted so light, and sometimes it can make it a little bit more tricky to brew. But even though my recipe, once again, is right in line with their recipe, it just doesn't seem to work out. Even my adjustments with the grind, no matter what I do, it just doesn't seem to be a good fit for what I'm trying to get from this coffee. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, it does lend itself to being a little bit more unique than a lot of the other Ethiopian coffees we have reviewed, given that it skews a lot more in the savory direction. So somebody that really enjoys their black tea-like characteristics to a coffee, that's kind of the best way I can point you towards in this one, because this had that in significant abundance between the flavor profile as well as the body. It really seemed to accentuate a lot more of the tea-like characteristics as opposed to the fruit characteristics, and it still offers great clarity. That's one thing I should highlight, is at least one of the really nice positives of this coffee is it's a very clean coffee. It does have a very defined sort of black tea-like profile to it. So that's another positive that I do want to highlight from this one. But I do think it's kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you've got a chance, had an opportunity to try this coffee, we'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you enjoyed the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Logita Wash Processed Ethiopia from Apollon's Gold. Thank you for watching.